They called it therapy. That's what the forms said. But no one remembered signing them. One moment you were a student, a soldier, a housewife. The next you were strapped to a hospital bed with electrodes behind your eyes and a voice asking how many stars you could see when your soul left your body. This wasn't fiction. This was a government program with a budget, a signature, and a purpose: to break open the human mind and see what came out. They said it was science. But the deeper you dig, the more it feels like something else. Like they weren't trying to cure insanity. They were trying to weaponize it. The name was MKUltra, and it ran for over 20 years inside the CIA. They used LSD to peel back consciousness, hypnosis to rewrite behavior, and isolation to shatter identity. But in a series of tests buried under code names and missing pages, something even stranger appeared. Subjects who claimed they left time, heard voices made of light, and entered places that didn't follow human rules. The agency didn't deny it. They recorded it, filed it, and stamped it Cosmic Journey. What began as mind control turned into something no one could explain, and no one was ever supposed to find. By the time those experiments began, the foundation for them had already been laid. In the early 1950s, the United States was trapped in a psychological arms race, terrified that its enemies had discovered ways to hijack thought itself. Reports from Korea told of soldiers returning home with fractured memories and rewritten loyalties. Newspapers called it brainwashing. Inside the CIA, that word turned into an obsession. Alan Dulles, a man who saw fear as opportunity, authorized a covert research empire that would operate outside of law, morality, or oversight. It would recruit doctors, hypnotists, chemists, and anyone willing to trade ethics for funding. The public would never hear its name, only the results it promised: total control of the human mind. The money moved quietly through shell foundations and front universities. Experiments spread through hospitals, military bases, and psychiatric wards. Each sub-project pushed further, blending hypnosis, electroshock, sensory deprivation, and chemicals like LSD in the search for a mind that could be erased and rewritten at will. On paper, it was about national defense. In practice, it became a map of psychological destruction. And tucked among those dry reports, just before the documents turned to black ink and redaction bars, a new term surfaced: Sub-Project 68, the earliest trace of what later operatives would nickname the Cosmic Journey. The Cold War wanted soldiers and secrets. What it created was something far stranger: a government learning not how to protect the mind, but how to dismantle it. Once the infrastructure was in place, the experiments moved quickly. Subjects were pulled from prisons, hospitals, even college campuses, often without being told anything at all. Some thought they were part of therapy studies. Others were tricked outright. They were given acid disguised as vitamin supplements, strapped into chairs under fluorescent lights, monitored through one-way mirrors by men who never gave their names. The goal wasn't healing, it was disintegration. The CIA wanted to know what happened when a human mind was stripped of memory, context, and control. How long until identity collapsed? How long until someone could be reassembled into something obedient? LSD became the centerpiece. It was powerful, unstable, and invisible. It didn't just alter perception, it broke it. Doses were tested in small increments, then pushed to extremes. One group of prisoners in Kentucky was dosed every day for over 2 months. In other trials, sleep was removed entirely. Language was dismantled. Subjects lost track of time, of space, of who they were. Some tried to escape. Others begged to continue. The data piled up. The agency marked each milestone as a success. But beneath the clean language of those reports, strange patterns began to emerge. Testimony that didn't match the drug profiles, descriptions of visions too complex to be dismissed. Subjects began reporting not hallucinations, but places, patterns, beings. And deep in the footnotes, researchers stopped correcting the language. They just wrote it down. The first time the reports mentioned the phrase cosmic journey, it appeared in the margins of a laboratory memo, half joke, half warning. Researchers had begun noticing anomalies that couldn't be explained by chemistry or psychology. Subjects under heavy LSD doses described identical experiences, even when isolated from each other. Geometric corridors made of sound, spiraling lights, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. One scientist compared it to entering a frequency beyond thought. Another wrote that the participants weren't hallucinating at all. They were receiving. The CIA took it seriously enough to create a sub-team devoted to mapping these shared visions, documenting every detail as if they were charting a new continent. The data was filed under a separate clearance code, far above the original MKUltra protocols. In these sessions, the language of science began to collapse. The test subjects spoke of voices that answered questions before they were asked, of entities that called themselves observers, of information flowing in colors. The researchers, some already fractured by their own exposure to LSD, started to believe that consciousness could move independently of the body. What began as an attempt to manipulate perception turned into an exploration of existence itself. Notes that once measured pulse rate and blood pressure began recording metaphysical statements. The subject perceives no boundary between death and observation. Time behaves like liquid. Intelligence appears non-human. To the agency, that wasn't madness. It was potential. If these states could be triggered, repeated, and controlled, then the mind might not just be a battlefield. It could be a gateway. At first, the reports still sounded clinical, but between the lines, something was unraveling. The test rooms grew darker, the doses heavier. Subjects were isolated for days, inside soundproof chambers, floating in salt water tanks, surrounded by low-frequency hums, designed to disrupt the brain's sense of time. Some were convinced they had left their bodies entirely. Others described themselves as splitting into several versions at once, observing their own consciousness from impossible angles. The researchers called it cross-phase cognition, a phrase that meant nothing outside those walls. In one memo, a supervising agent wrote that repeated exposure to these states produces uncontainable phenomena. The handwriting was shaky, as though the person documenting it no longer trusted what they were seeing. The deeper they went, the more unstable everything became. Machines malfunctioned without reason. Magnetic tapes played back with voices that weren't present during recording. Subjects began responding to questions before they were asked, predicting events that occurred minutes later. A few died of heart failure mid-session. Others emerged, claiming they had spoken to entities that told them never to return. The CIA's interest only intensified. If these altered states could tap into information that transcended time, they could be weaponized. What had begun as a study of control had transformed into a race to harness whatever consciousness had just touched. It was no longer about bending minds. It was about breaching reality itself. By the late 1960s, the experiments had outgrown their handlers. Reports from the Cosmic Journey sessions began to conflict so violently that the project fractured under its own secrecy. Some scientists quit without notice, convinced they were part of something inhuman. Others were found in psychiatric hospitals, rambling about dimensions that looked back. One researcher vanished after mailing his notes to a newspaper that never published them. Inside the agency, whispers circulated about cross-contamination. The idea that exposure to subjects during peak LSD states was changing the observers too. Audio recordings filled with distortions, distorted frequencies that analysts swore were structured speech. The CIA quietly began purging records, reassigning personnel, and burning data. Officially, the justification was budget realignment. Unofficially, they were terrified of what might be leaking through. When Congress finally began asking questions in the early 70s, almost everything was gone. Boxes of files had been shredded on the order of outgoing Director Helms, leaving only fragments, a few memoranda, scattered expense forms, and the testimonies of ruined lives. The surviving researchers spoke carefully, as if afraid the words themselves carried infection. They described the project's collapse as a containment effort, not a termination. Even as they dismantled the labs, some experiments continued off-record under civilian contracts. MKUltra was declared dead in 1973, but the timing was suspicious. The documents that remained were enough to prove it existed, never enough to explain what it became. In the space where evidence should have been, there was only silence, and in that silence, the sense that the work had simply changed its name. After the hearings ended, and the last witnesses faded from the news cycle, the world assumed the story was over. The CIA called MKUltra a historical mistake, a relic of Cold War hysteria. Yet within a few years, the same scientists who had helped design its experiments re-emerged under new funding programs with softer names: behavioral research, cognitive modeling, human-computer interaction. The laboratories were no longer hidden. They were inside universities, sponsored by technology grants. The language had changed, but the questions hadn't. How do you predict a choice before it's made? How do you reshape perception without the subject realizing? The new experiments didn't need LSD. They had algorithms. By the 1990s, the battlefield had shifted from the body to the screen. Intelligence agencies began partnering with private companies to analyze attention, emotion, and persuasion at scale. The tools were social platforms, not syringes. Every click, every search, every hesitation became a data point feeding the same ambition that once drove MKUltra: control without consent. It was cheaper, cleaner, and infinitely more effective. The Cold War obsession with the mind had simply evolved into the architecture of the digital age. What once required a laboratory could now be done with a notification tone. The project never ended. It just learned how to hide in plain sight. Today, the name MKUltra sits in documentaries and textbooks, treated like a strange Cold War footnote, something the government did once and learned from. But the echoes are everywhere. The techniques of suggestion, repetition, and sensory manipulation are no longer confined to secret labs. They exist in the design of digital interfaces, the language of advertising, the psychology of mass influence. Each scroll, each click, each tailored recommendation is part of an unseen experiment, testing how far perception can be guided before resistance fades. The tools have changed, the outcome hasn't. A compliant mind is still the most valuable resource a government or corporation can own. The original scientists wanted to access the subconscious. Today's engineers can live there. Through constant stimulation, reward cycles, and surveillance disguised as convenience, the architecture of control has become self-sustaining. People monitor themselves, confess their desires to machines, and feed data to systems that study them better than any psychiatrist ever could. It's still MKUltra, just automated, aesthetic, and socially acceptable. The mind is no longer the battlefield, it's the product. If they could erase memory in 1956 with a syringe and a mirror, what can they do now with 1 billion fingerprints, 20 years of search history, and your own voice repeating back into the algorithm? The experiment was never about LSD or electrodes. It was about access. The kind that doesn't need to ask permission. The kind that makes you believe every thought was yours to begin with. MKUltra wasn't a failure. It was a prototype. And by the time the public learned its name, the real version had already moved on.